I want to frame the question this evening in terms of sustainability. It's a word that's being used more and more now. And what I have up here is basically the standard definition of sustainability. It's the characteristic of a process or state that can be maintained at a certain level indefinitely. And I usually use a number of examples to kind of get that point across. Processes in nature that most people are at least somewhat familiar with. And I'll start with the water cycle. Most everything that happens on this planet is powered by the sun, and the water cycle is no different. The sun shines on our bodies of water, and it evaporates that water. The water forms clouds. Those clouds move across the land and cools, and you have precipitation of rain or snow, depending on where you are. That feeds the land, waters the land, and it's collected in our streams and rivers, and eventually goes out into the bodies of water again, and the process begins all over again. And the important thing to kind of take home from this is the fact that it's a cycle. Another cycle that most people are familiar with is the oxygen cycle. Again, powered by the sun. The plant kingdom will bring in carbon dioxide. What is called sequesters the carbon in its stems and leaves and its fruit, and gives off oxygen. That oxygen, in turn, is taken in, breathed in, if you will, by the animal kingdom. It'll eat the fruits of the plants and combine that carbon and oxygen to give itself energy. It basically burns the carbon inside our bodies. We're part of this animal kingdom, as I'm sure you're aware. And we give off carbon dioxide, and that, again, is brought in by the plant kingdom, and the process starts all over again. Two fairly well-known processes, and again, it's cyclical in nature. There's another principle that you may or may not have heard about. It's called, it's given the nickname of the Gaia principle. And what that idea is supposed to get across, is the fact that our Earth's biosphere effectively acts as a self-organizing, regulating system, which works in such a way to keep all its systems in some kind of equilibrium that is conducive to life. So in some sense, you might want to think of the whole planet as a living entity, made up of countless cycles of life. Unfortunately, there's a human disconnect. And this is something that I go into in quite some detail as I teach. I forgot to mention that I teach the Science, Technology, and Society course in college. And we talk about how humans got to start using tools. And it all started, interestingly enough, by the fact that we developed an opposing thumb. That opposing thumb gave us the ability to grab things. And so we are very distinct in the animal world for that ability, and our ability to then in turn use things as tools. We are a tool using species, if you will, that distinguishes us. And our brain has actually become hardwired to see ourselves as separate. That was an important development, because we need to see ourselves as separate from the tool we're grabbing and what we're applying the tool to. So in the course of our own development as a species, our brain has basically become hardwired to see the self as separate from everything else in the world. And we've developed a knowledge base that's based on that. Rationality is basically a process of naming and then categorizing all the things we see around us. At times when I talk about this, I basically say, we should be treating the environment. Basically, it comes down to we should be treating the environment better because the big guy upstairs says it's good. And if the big guy says it's good, well, that means I should probably think it's good too. I should take care of it and respect it and have reverence for it. But I think we can dig deeper into our tradition, our religious tradition, and basically kind of zero in on that second story of creation where it tells about our loss of relationship. We begin the naming process, right? That's right there in the Bible. And we take from the tree of knowledge, which starts us distinguishing, seeing ourselves as separate. And that's a story that I think actually is reflected in many religions across the world, the religions that have withstood the test of time, at least. And basically, in a way, it's almost the function of religion. If you go back anthropologically, you will see that religion starts almost from at the same time that we begin to use tools. And in my view, it was there, it developed to try to in some way remind us that we still have that sense of relationship that we've lost, and that we are more than our skin-encapsulated ego, and that we come from the earth and are a part of the earth. That's a story that we need to get across in some way. We can talk about it in theistic terms or whatever works to get across that, to restore this sense of relationship that we have lost at the beginning of our development. So right off the bat, I think that's one message that religion can bring to the table, if you will, and be about pointing that out. In the absence of a sense of relationship and the wisdom that comes with that, we have typically used our resources in a linear fashion. We extract the resources, we process those resources, we use those resources very often in a one-time use, and then we dispose of those resources. Very different from the way resources are used in nature. It's very artificial, ultimately unsustainable. We cannot continue to use resources in a finite world with finite resources in this linear fashion. It's just impossible. That almost should be intuitive, but unfortunately it's not. And in 1972, there was a study by Dennis and Delana Meadows, colleagues at MIT, and they produced a book called Limits to Growth. In retrospect, it was probably an unfortunate title. Sounds almost un-American. But what they did was basically applied computer models, and they were somewhat limited at the time. Computers were not as powerful as they exist today. But even then, those computer models were telling us a very significant piece of information. They were basically projecting out our use of materials, our population growths, and so forth. And they mapped out and made the case that we can't, just basically what I just previously said, that we can't continue to use our resources in that linear fashion, that there's limits to that mode of operation. Interestingly enough, at that same year, the American Baptist Board of National Ministries released a major study of social trends to determine a contemporary context of that church's mission. By the way, that study was the first, also had studies that had maps, for instance, that showed how waste dumps, you take waste dumps and where they're located and where poor people are located, and it's basically the same map. So it was those types of insights that were a part of that study. And like I said, they wanted to do some structural change of institutions towards an ecological wholeness and a social justice orientation. And they were the first ones that coined the word eco-justice. And they meant it to mean that we should be looking at both ecological wholeness and social justice in the same context. 1 year later, in 1973, there was a group of campus ministers and faculty from the Cornell University and the Rochester Institute of Technology. They gathered in Seneca Falls, New York, probably very apropos, since that was where the women's movement started, if you recall. But they met there to examine what they felt was the new consciousness of ecological limits. They had read that book, Limits to Growth, and they wanted to examine the new consciousness of ecological limits and its implications for justice, survival, and the values by which people live. And so they took the term sustainability and redefined it, or refocused it, if you will. And they took it to mean that sustainability is the meeting of the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Kind of a more people-oriented definition of sustainability. And if you think about it, it's almost like the Christian equivalent to the seventh generation concept of the American Indians, if you will. So they redefined sustainability, and they also took a little liberty with the term eco-justice that they were also aware of, and they combined economic justice and ecological justice to form eco-justice, and that's how they understood eco-justice. Pretty similar, but little better play on words, I think. They became sort of a think tank, and they kept on meeting. They had a lot of interdenominational support at the time, and they put on many a conference and put out a number of publications, but all focused on this concept of eco-justice. And one of the things they came to the conclusion of was that all industrial societies were built on two erroneous beliefs. One, that the natural resources necessary for material well-being are essentially infinite and available to be harnessed technologically for the common good. Remember, this is the erroneous belief, but a concept that seems like that's the mode we operate in, or seem to think that this is, we can continue to do this, and that again, that the biosphere, the air, land, and water, is capable of endless absorption of poisonous waste without itself being poisoned and poisoning the creatures, including humans, that depend on it. Again, we live in a finite world with finite resources. And here again, I think the church is in a unique position to hold up against that whole mindset is basically idolatry. It's worshiping false gods, the false gods of materialism and the false gods of consumerism. But unfortunately, these are two concepts that Americans in particular, they get their sense of meaning and sense of purpose from these two concepts. You know, when you're down, what do? You go shopping, right? And when America's attacked as we were in 9/11, what does the president step up to the plate and say? Well, be sure to keep on consuming. You know, not pray or hug somebody. Don't forget to go out and buy. That was his essential message at the time. And he was just playing in with our basic values that we as a society tend to emphasize. So the Eco-Justice Project wanted to change that dialogue from more versus less to more of the same versus something different and better. And again, I think this is a message that I think the church can incorporate and give insights. The world, and especially our society, is crying out for this message. So it developed four things that the eco-justice could be used to look and analyze our society. Eco-justice can be used as a lens. It could be used, it's a way of looking at economic issues through the lens of environmental sustainability, and looks at environmental issues through the lens of economic justice. It's a different way of looking at and analyzing problems. It can be a vision. The vision is the well-being of humankind on a thriving world, not a vision of well-being of humans, and not a vision of a thriving Earth, but the two together. And that's really the only way we can survive. It can be a journey. It's about living out or modeling, if you will, that vision as individuals and as a community, and especially as a church community. And then thinking of through implications and strategy. And it's also an ethic. It's an ends-oriented and means-clarifying through sustainability, solidarity, and sufficiency. So let's see what that lens can do as we might want to visit that resource utilization model that I put up there previously. Again, it's unsustainable. That would be the first conclusion that we could come to. But each side of that equation, both the extraction side and the disposal side, has negative impacts. Let's first look at the extraction side. From the environmental side of things, when you're extracting, you're destroying habitat, you're disturbing the soil, discharging into the land, water, and air. These are all consequences of our mining. There's a soil depletion that goes on. We're losing tremendous amounts of topsoil as we mine the soil, if you will. And you can even think of our farming practices as mining the soil. Again, it used to be, we used to fertilize naturally. Now we use chemicals. And what most people don't understand is actually chemicals don't add nutrients to the soil. They make the nutrients of the soil that's already there more mobile, so the plants can bring up those nutrients easier. So it is a mining of the nutrients of the soil in a very real way. And then our energy consumption, I don't know if people are aware that really there's a ton of energy that goes into just producing our products, to the tune of about 70% of the latent energy kind of embedded in the product is already consumed, if you will, when we in the making and transporting of the product. And that, of course, is contributing to pollution and global warming. There's a social side of all this, of course, and as resources are continued to be used, a scarcity builds up. In some ways, the environmentalists got it wrong when they said we'd run out of material. That's not exactly how the process works. What happens is the resource becomes more and more scarce, and the price of the product goes up. And eventually, it'll put that resource out of the reach of just about everybody except the people who can afford it. Now, we in this country are kind of insulated from that because we're a rich country. We can afford to get ours. But if you look at it in a global sense, the more resources we use, it's putting those resources out of reach of more and more people. And that's what we witness today in the world. The fact that these resources are getting more and more scarce and more expensive, the countries are scrambling to get some piece of the pie, if you will, and they're going in debt to do it, which actually increases world tension and increases their debt, obviously, so that most third world countries are tremendously in debt because they're trying to compete with for the same resources that we are using. And that, I would submit, has increased national tension, and I would say was one of the major causes of the terrorism that we experience today. That terrorism is more a function of the fact that third world countries can't afford bombers to deliver their bombs. They come up with other ways to deliver their bombs. And that's what we see in the form of terrorism today. And I'm sure I'm not surprising anybody when I say, you know, we're not over in the Middle East because of the sand. Now, when you consider this competition for resources, the future is an even worse situation because they don't even exist yet. So in their competition for these resources, they're at a very distinct disadvantage. And of course, all this use of resources is limiting their possibilities and their ability to exist in the future. Those resources are being put out of reach for future generations. We can also look at the disposal side. And again, I hope you're getting the sense that all these issues have a social dimension and an environmental dimension. Again, the environmental dimension of disposal, the ground water is polluted, and we're aware more and more of that phenomena for a long time. I mean, I like to give the benefit of the doubt, for instance, that when IBM was disposing of its waste in the groundwater, that the whole groundwater phenomena was poorly understood at the time. So it was okay to just inject poisons into the ground. But we know how that's coming back to haunt us, and this obviously, you know, we can get bottled water, I suppose, and continue to do that, but it's going to be very difficult to keep all those pollutants out of the food chain, which will be problematic if we continue to go down this route. There's atmospheric pollution. The smog and the acid rain that's causing the lake and tree deaths and health impacts. The ozone depletion that it wasn't too long ago that was big, a big issue. It's still a big issue, but it's been eclipsed by the climate change issue. And then, like I said, the CO2 and the methane, which I'll get back to in a minute, that's causing the climate change, both the change in weather and the flooding. Again, there's a social dimension to disposal. Obviously, it's a disproportional burden that's on any local community that's unlucky enough to have a landfill sited in it. That was my district, by the way, that I represented in the county. That's where all your waste goes, into the northern Broome, where that takes all your waste, our waste, and basically stores it. But I'll get back to that in a minute. The other problem, of course, with landfills is the fact that basically it's not really dealing with the waste. It's basically just leaving it there for future generations to either clean up or suffer the consequences of it. So let's take a moment to basically look at what a landfill is all about. You have a piece of land, you dig a hole, you line it, which is a good thing, of course. It's about the only thing you can do with it. Pretty sophisticated liners, as a matter of fact. There's liners that's put in, and then it's filled with waste, and then it's capped. And then they do put in gas collection, because once the waste is put in there, it starts generating methane. But basically, all we're doing is taking our little bags of waste and putting it into one big giant bag. That's all we're really doing. Double lined and for protection, capped off, but basically warehousing it. Little trivia, did you know that there's no guarantee that those liners protecting our groundwater from the waste will last longer than the waste that it's being stored? In fact, it probably won't. In fact, the official guarantee on those liners are 5 years. Since there's no way to predict repair and cleanup costs, there's no money set aside to pay remediation. There is money set aside to cap it, and maintain the cap for 20 years. And that's about the extent of how much money we've socked away to remediate any problems that come off of that landfill in the future. Did you know that landfill caps require constant maintenance forever? You know, that putting aside money for 20 years, well, that'll take the first 20 years, take care of the first 20 years. But after that, you'll see deterioration of that cap. Once the cap is destroyed, basically there's always a little bit of methane gas generated, but once the cap is compromised, water gets in, and then things really start cooking, and the methane really starts being produced. Like I said, the cost that's charged for that disposal only pays for the first 20 years, and the fugitive methane that's escaping exceeds the amount that's captured by a factor of 4 to 1. Methane is a greenhouse gas, and it's actually 103 times more potent than carbon dioxide. You know, everybody's focused on carbon dioxide, which is important, and actually that's the biggest amount that we're dealing with. The trouble is methane, while it's a smaller amount, is 103 times more potent than carbon dioxide. And landfills, at least for the United States, within the United States, are the biggest contributors to methane. Just kind of keep that all in your head, because we'll be coming back to that when we discuss climate change. So how could we make our actions more sustainable? It should be pretty obvious. After we use the resources, we should be recovering those resources and reprocessing those resources. Creating that cycle, just like nature creates a cycle as it utilizes resources. We need to reduce, if not eliminate, extraction, and reduce, if not eliminate, disposal. Some strategies for reducing disposal. We can certainly design our products better so that we can facilitate recovery and recycling. We can compost organics. Organics should not be going into a landfill. Methane gas is only created because we put organics into the landfill to begin with. Methane is not a part of that material. It's created after it's in the landfill. So the easiest way to stop that process is not put it in there to begin with. And then another strategy that I'm very much a part of nowadays with the Sierra Club, we're proposing what we call extended producer responsibility. It's something that Europeans have already started, and basically what it comes down to is requires the producer of a product to submit a plan on how they're going to recover that product and bring it back into that loop. And they can either do it through their own mechanisms that they want to set up, or they can pay municipalities or some common vendor to kind of buy into a cooperative, if you will, to do it. But that they're responsible to do that. It'll obviously become part of the price of the product. But guess what, folks? We're already paying, or we'll have the future generations paying that price. So why not make it a part of the price of the product, so you see it up front and be done with it? And then, of course, the idea here is that if they have to think about and pay for it, they might redesign their products to make that more feasible and more efficient. Let's look at climate change for a second. And actually, I really see climate change as basically, in many ways, part of the same problem. It's a linear use of carbon. That carbon has been sequestered over the eons. Some people, that carbon dioxide used to be in the atmosphere. We were a planet very similar to Venus in that regard. But over the eons, as life began, the process of life started sequestering that carbon into the plant life. And eventually that plant life became buried in the earth and formed our fossil fuels. That's where fossil fuels came from. The problem is obviously now we're releasing that sequestered carbon that took eons to do, and now we're facing the situation that we're facing now, because we're releasing carbon faster than it can be sequestered. And we're not only burning fossil fuels, obviously, but also we're like deforesting our forests, and that's they're very efficient. The forests are very efficient sequestering mechanisms, if you want to think about it that way. For those of you who may not be aware, kind of a simplified greenhouse effect, what's going on here. The sun, if you think of a greenhouse and how that reacts, basically your sun at a higher frequency light wave comes into a greenhouse. It's absorbed by the contents within the greenhouse, which emits a lower frequency form of energy in the form of infrared, and the glass, while it transmits the higher frequencies, block the lower frequency energies. Another example that most people are aware of, just simply close up your car in the wintertime on a sunny day, and it'll heat up on its own. That's basically the greenhouse effect. Of course, our atmosphere is a bit more complicated, but basically is following the same principles. The sun is shining in, and there's a certain amount of reflection that naturally goes on, both within the atmosphere itself, but also as it hits the Earth, especially the ice sheets. Keep that in mind, because I'm going to return to that, because the ice sheets serve as our reflectors as well. But a lot of it gets absorbed in the land, and stuff of our Earth absorbs that, turns it into infrared, and which would naturally radiate out, except for the greenhouse gases. Now, of course, we want a certain amount of greenhouse effect to occur. We'd be a very cold planet if it didn't. But the more greenhouse gases build up, you get an increase in heat storing capacity, or heat buildup capacity. So what are some of the effects that we might expect from climate change? We know there's a rise in sea level as the ice sheets melt. There's an increase in extreme weather as the atmosphere becomes more energetic. There's increases of tornadoes and floodings, which is really all a matter of, when the atmosphere gets more energetic, it's just dissipating that built-up energy. And we're more susceptible to increase in cold spells and heat waves, and dramatic day-to-day changes in the weather. We can expect an increase in frequency and intensity of hurricanes. Again, it's basically the Earth's way of dissipating energy. If you want to think about hurricanes in that fashion, it's the Earth trying to dissipate built-up energy. And there'll be significant changes in regional climates. Greater droughts in some areas, wind and ocean current pattern shifting, and the like. Now, some people have mentioned that there's some natural cycles going on that always create these changes, which is true, but nowhere near the rapidity of it. The fact that it's changing very, very fast. Given eons, life can adapt to a lot of these changes, but a lot of life can't adapt to the very rapid change. Populations of animals can migrate to other places. Actually, trees actually migrate too, if you think about it. And how they migrate is basically the seeds get blown into more favorable, the favorable side of the forest, and so you'll see over time forests moving around too. But of course, they're not going to be able to adapt to a rapid change in climate that we're talking about. Let's look at that a little further. These are the three main greenhouse gases that people are concerned about: carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrogen oxide. And on the third column there, the second column is just their chemical designation. The third column is the parts per billion in volume. You can see, like I mentioned earlier, the carbon dioxide is quite a bit more than the methane or the nitrogen oxide. And the main sources of each of those gases, carbon dioxide is from the fossil fuel combustion, land use conversion, and cement production, believe it or not. Methane, the biggest sources of methane is, like I mentioned, waste landfills, rice paddies, and livestock. Actually, if you look at it at a global level, rice paddies beats out landfills, but here in the US, we don't have very many rice paddies. We have a lot of landfills, and that takes the prominent place. And again, taking those multiplier effects, and methane, I mentioned, it was 103 times more potent. Nitrogen oxide is 310 more times more potent than carbon dioxide. So when you take those factors into account, carbon dioxide is still on top with about 57% of the problem, if you will. But methane shoots up dramatically when you factor in its effects. So we want to be doing something about those landfills. This is a chart that shows the buildup of those gases over time, starting with 0, the year of our Lord. And you can see those the fluctuations that occur. But starting in the 1800s, you can see dramatic changes in those, in the buildup of those three gases. The questions about climate change usually comes across, well, is climate change real? I think we've kind of left that one in the dust. But the next one, the next attack of climate change was, well, is it human caused? That was the next big debate that went on for a while. Well, that chart really shows something quite different. That chart almost exactly lines up with our the industrial age, basically. Now, the real question that has occurred now, that's occurring now, and there is still some significant debate on, and that is, can we contain the damage? And another one that's kind of out there, and people are seriously debating it, is it already out of control? There are some scientists that have basically said it's already out of control no matter what we do. It's out of our control. And you can see why there might be some debate about that. The processes are complex to that extent. And so you will see some debate about that. But I'm hoping that people understand that when they see difference of opinion on that, it's not really questioning whether climate change is real or not, or whether it's human caused or not, but exactly how it's going to manifest itself. That's still under debate. And what has really gotten people concerned is the fact that the ice melt is, all those computer models that I was mentioning, they obviously got a lot more sophisticated over time. They were wrong. All the computer models fail to predict the rapid ice melt that we're experiencing today. So it's worse than all the computer models were indicating. Why is that significant? Remember I mentioned earlier the fact that there's a certain degree of reflection that goes on that keeps that light energy from even turning into infrared energy that would be blocked by the greenhouse gases. It simply gets reflected back out into space. But as those as the ice melts, we lose that capacity. So more light is being absorbed now than before. It's not being reflected anymore. And we're experiencing significant decreases in glaciers in a very, very short period of time as these things usually take much longer to change. And you can see from this photo how rapid, just between 1979 and the year 2003, how much it decreased. The Arctic Sea has lost its ice caps. So that's why they're getting to be concerned. And as that happens, they're also concerned about the permafrost, the land being uncovered by the ice, exposing the land, that land being warmed up, and that also starting to cook and produce methane. And those are processes that they're natural. We kind of set it in motion, but those are processes that we can't do anything about reversing. So, and that's why they're concerned that we could very well have already tipped it over so far that nothing we can do on our activities are going to be able to counteract those natural processes that we have set into motion. There's no magic bullet here. There's no one bullet that's going to solve this issue. They typically talk about wedge strategies that will chip away at it. And unfortunately, the bad news is just about anything we come up with, we got to do all of them to make a significant turnaround. We can't just do one or two or three. We got to do all of them to turn it around, if we can turn it around at all. So, some strategies that have been put forward: increase energy efficiency and conservation. Bang for the buck, that's probably the best we have going for us, because it's compared to the other ones, it's cheap. It's cheaper to just become more efficient at our energy use. We'll be needing to retrofit all the existing fossil fuels, put them out of commission, or if not put them out of commission, retrofit them so that they have carbon sequestering systems on it. Costs money, but it's got to be done. And quite frankly, they're still experimental. So again, there's no magic bullet here. We have to start shifting to non-carbon-based energy sources. And then we have to increase our biostorage capacity. Certainly stop the deforestation that is going on, but actually not simply stop it, we have to reverse it. We have to plant a tree. And there's some other ways of tackling that biostorage capacity. And again, experimental technologies, but it's all going to have to be brought to bear if we're going to see our way clear of this problem. This slide probably needs no introduction. It's our Earth. That's our atmosphere. A lot of it nitrogen, oxygen, of course, that's a good thing. Carbon dioxide is still relatively small. Just compare that to Venus. Remember I said this may be what our Earth looked like eons ago, before the plant kingdom started whittling away, first establishing life, which is a miracle in and of itself, right? And then the plant life started whittling away at that carbon dioxide and started sequestering that carbon dioxide to bring it down to where we are today, a livable planet that we can live in. I mean, Venus is existing very nicely out there, thank you very much. So we can't destroy this planet in a sense. That's not what we're really talking about here. It's really, are we changing it in such a way that it will no longer be able to support life, certainly life as we know it. That's the issue. It's not about destroying the planet. So really, the choice is ours. I'm going to briefly tell my personal story. It's basically, well, it's not me, it's my family really, and how we try to walk the talk, if you will. That's our house out in the Whitney Point area. We've been covered by all kinds of media, both national, international, TV, print, and it's amazing how often they come and almost their first reaction is, these people look normal. But looks can be deceiving, and I'll let you take that any way you want. But I'll speak to the house anyway. The fact that, okay, it looks like a standard house, but actually there's a lot, it's a house that I designed and built, and there's a lot of things that you don't see, but such as, or not, it doesn't immediately jump out at you, but the walls are thicker, there's a lot more insulation in it. You don't see a front door, but actually that's a foyer which you approach from the side, a porch that goes into a foyer that essentially acts as an airlock. So you have to go through two doors and close one before you go into the other door. All these little things are all about making it more energy efficient, such that our 1 year energy use, we've gotten it down to basically 20 pounds of propane, the size of a barbecue grill tank, plus solar and wind. And I should be upfront with you that basically we chose that wind option for your electricity, so that's kind of built into that equation. So yeah, we do have electricity, but it's from wind. So through energy efficiency, use of solar, and use of electric that's generated by wind, that's basically, you could think of that as our fossil footprint, at least from our house side. Another view of the house, the back end, and you'll see like the back end, this is like a 27-foot attached greenhouse that is really nice to be in those cold but sunny winter days. And if you think about it, actually the coldest days are generally the sunniest days because you've lost your cloud cover. That's what makes it cold, but that's what really starts cooking the solar collectors. And basically, I did have some active solar of a design of my making, but just like inventors sometimes do, we fail, and I failed at that particular design. But the house itself, a lot of south-facing windows and that attached greenhouse has helped us achieve that reduced fossil fuel input. In terms of our waste production, they tell us the average person produces 1,500 pounds per year, or basically works out to be 4 pounds per day. Now, here in this community, you can be proud of the fact that you're less than that, actually, because of the recycling program that's in place. And I'm assuming here you're using that recycling program, so that you're about maybe 40% of that. We, as a family of, we average 3/4 of a pound per person per year. Okay? And we've been doing that since 1992. Now, we didn't get there overnight. Basically, our commitment started with the first Earth Day in 1970. And we've just been working at it. So I want to say that up front too, because I don't want this figure to become an impediment and a barrier. Oh, I simply can't do it. Because we weren't there originally either. But it shows what you can do if you work at it, and start working the way into your lifestyle and your habits, your buying habits, your recycling habits, your composting habits. What we do, strategies, we refuse, prevention, that's all in the buying habits. We ask that basic question, do we really need it? It's amazing how many times that question is not asked when people go to the stores, do we really need it? And then we basically follow the philosophy, if we are buying it, are we willing to take responsibility for it? And that means disposal is off the table as an option. We have to take responsibility for it. We have to find a way to recycle it, do whatever, but disposal is not an option for us. So we refuse, reuse, recycle, and just to keep the R's going, we reclaim or compost. That's our basic strategies in a nutshell. That's 15 years worth of waste. We actually consider it our failures. That's because that's what we're struggling with. What are we going to do with that waste? We figured it out though that at this rate, my wife and I are going to go to that great compost heap in the sky before that 32-gallon can of waste gets filled up, and the kids that have always not had to take out the garbage all these years will finally have to take out that 1 can of garbage. So anyway, I wanted to leave you with that personal story, just to say and suggest that really it's all about for our message to be authentic, we're going to have to learn to walk the talk too. If our message to the world is we need to respect God's creation, and how do you do that? We have to model that we have a message to give. Hopefully you'll take that away from this talk, but also maybe a commitment to start modeling how we should be living our lives in harmony with our creation. What am I looking for in a candidate? I want to get some sense that the candidate gets it, number one. Number one, and even more important, or not as more important, but almost equally important, that he can communicate that and basically get us all pulling in the same direction. All three of those aspects are going to be very important for us to. The size of the issue, the problem, is so vast that we're going to need all three of those within a candidate. One that gets it, really gets it, can articulate it, and then can inspire people, because we're going to have to move as a whole society. It's not so much a knowledge thing. It's almost a change of heart, and I'm not expecting the candidate to use. He doesn't have to use religious language, but something close to religious language to be able to have a change in heart, because it's too easy. The knowledge, this knowledge that I've presented, most of it's been around for a long time. We've been in denial. So knowledge is not the issue. It's a change of heart, and we're going to need a candidate that can be a part of that process. The churches have to be a part of it too. But, we are not the most populated country in the world, but we use the dominant portion of the resources, both oil, but also just about everything else. And again, we've modeled it for everybody else. They can't follow this model. It's impossible. It's an impossibility for them to follow our model. We speak of God in a lot of different ways, and a lot of our language is very theist-oriented. But of course, we also have this concept of God that's much bigger than that. It's not. It's the God, the Alpha, the Omega, the God that is is bigger, is everything. And we're certainly a part of that. So we're part of the earth, but the earth is part of something bigger too, isn't it? We're part of this this larger sense of what God is all about. That's something that we project onto our world. This separation, and like I was suggesting, it's kind of hardwired into our brains, and we had to. It was an important development in our survival. If we hadn't learned how to use tools, we're kind of a pretty puny species without our ability to use tools in our brains. So it was an important survival technique, but unfortunately, it set up other phenomena too, and that was that separation that we had to see ourselves as separate from the tool. We had to see ourselves as separate from what we're applying the tool to. But at some point, and this in a way was religion's main function, was to remind us that that's a projection that we've projected out onto the world, that really we're all part of a whole that we've just kind of divided up in our brains. But of course, when we do that, we kind of treat the world differently when we kind of fall into that mindset. Elections, especially national elections, are so driven by money. The conservatives, anyway, or at least some conservatives, talk about money as free speech. Well, if that's truly the case, then there's whole segments of our society that have a lot more free speech than a lot of us. So those two in combination are really, I think, undermining our whole democracy. That's my view of it. And so all we have left really is to organize and raise our voices, because if it's in the competition for money, we lose.